The world's 9 nuclear-armed states spent nearly $83 billion on their arsenals in 2022, the third straight year of increases. That's according to the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, a non-profit that tracks spending on atomic weapons. The U.S. alone accounted for more than half of total spending, but China also saw a big jump, increasing both its stockpile and overall spending. A separate report by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, showed that overall nuclear stockpiles were down from last year, but that the amount of usable nuclear weapons went up. The world's nuclear powers are also rapidly modernizing their arsenals, deploying new weapon systems. Currently, the US and Russia account for nearly 90% of all nuclear weapons. But China saw gains last year, expanding its stockpile from 350 warheads in January 2022 to 410 just a year later. SIPRI estimates that China could potentially have as many intercontinental ballistic missiles as the US and Russia by early next decade. And now to discuss nuclear spending around the world, joining me now from Utrecht, Netherlands, is Susi Snyder. She is the program coordinator at the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And from Vienna, Ksenia Pirnavskaia. She is a research consultant at Open Nuclear Network. Ladies, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you on the program. So, Susi, why is spending on nuclear weapons on the rise? What has triggered this major hike?
Well, this is the fourth time that the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons has published an annual report looking at global nuclear spending. And every year, spending is on the rise. And the reason is because the 9 nuclear-armed governments are all seeking to modernize and expand the capacity of their nuclear arsenals. And that doesn't happen for free.
So the world's 9 nuclear-armed states, as you've mentioned, the joints spent about $83 billion on their arsenals only last year, with the United States accounting for more than half of that. So, Ksenia, has this always been the case? Has the U.S. always made up the lion's share?
Thank you for this question. Well, United States has historically been one of the largest spenders on its nuclear arsenal and consistently accounting for a significant portion of global nuclear weapon spending. And they traditionally allocated a substantial portion of their military budget on the nuclear weapons related activities and developments. And this trend remains.
So, according to the SIPRI report, Susi, China also saw huge gains, increasing its stockpile from 350 to 410 warheads. What has spurred China to increase its stockpile, you think?
Well, this is one of the trickiest things. We have no idea what's actually in the minds of decision makers when they allocate money or allocate resources to their nuclear weapons programs. And that's what makes deterrence such a challenging idea, because you need to know what's in the mind of your adversary for deterrence to be effective. We do see that China has increased its spending around 6%. And even though China doesn't admit to a lot of its program, it's not very transparent. Thanks to excellent work through open source investigation, we've seen this increase in their capacity, which is an increase we're seeing mirrored across all of the nuclear-armed countries.
So, Ksenia, I mean, what do you think? How are tensions between the United States and China adding to this upward trend on nuclear weapons spending globally?
Well, indeed, first, the US and China rivalry has led to a reevaluation of defense needs and priorities globally. Both countries view each other as strategic competitors, and this perception has prompted them to enhance further their military capabilities, including their nuclear arsenals. Well, second, as the spending on nuclear weapons rises in the United States, of course, it prompts China's concern about maintaining a credible deterrent on their side. So China may feel the need to invest in its nuclear forces further to address any perceived capability gaps and assert itself as a major nuclear power. And last but not the least, the regional security dynamics in Asia-Pacific region, of course, influenced by the US and China rivalry, because other countries in the region may also increase their defense spending to counterbalance perceived threats from both states. And I think South Korean debate about acquisition of nuclear weapons is a great example of that.
So apart from China, Susi, India also saw rapid increases, spending 21% more in 2022 than it did in the previous year. What fueled that increase, you think?
Well, as my colleague was just saying, it's important to think about what's happening within the region. And India is also looking to China as a strategic competitor. Not only that, India is increasing its capacities. So it's developing a new nuclear armed submarine, and that's very expensive. Also in 2022, they bought a lot of airplanes from France, which are then they're planning to arm and are part of their nuclear weapons budget, planning to arm with nuclear weapons. So that also had a hefty price tag. So India is buying more and more capabilities. It's also developing a new long-range missile that it hasn't had previously in its arsenal. And these are expensive items. And that's why India saw such a big increase. Other countries with nuclear submarines are also seeing quite significant increases as well. Submarines are expensive.
So, Ksenia, is the war in Ukraine forcing countries to recalibrate their defense needs, or the war is being used as an excuse for this increase in spending?
Well, this is a very complicated question because, of course, the conflict in Ukraine poses regional security concerns because the conflict in Ukraine has underscored the importance of regional security for neighboring countries. The conflict has demonstrated that territorial disputes and military aggression can still occur in Europe, challenging the notion of stability of the post-Cold War times. And also, the Western perception of Russia as an aggressor made countries, of course, reevaluate their defense priorities and their capabilities, which is also part of meeting NATO targets on military spending and enhancing their overall defense posture. And also, the conflict in Ukraine has exposed the limitations of outdated military equipment and capabilities, which also forces country to reevaluate how much money they spend on their military aspect. And to your question whether it is being used to justify nuclear weapon spending, indeed, but we have to consider that this is not the sole reason behind that, because the budgets on military are influenced by a variety of factors, and the sole conflict in Ukraine cannot be considered as a major factor, but it is definitely used to justify, at least in front of the public of those countries, because this is a very easily perceived threat.
So, Susi, what would a prolonged Ukraine conflict mean for the world's weapons supplies? Which country is benefiting from the Ukraine war the most when it comes to weapons sales?
Well, one of the things that we have seen is that, as was mentioned, NATO countries are seeking to increase and to reach their goal of 2% GDP. Now, one of NATO's goals is to have interoperability of its weapons systems. That means a German pilot can fly a plane in Turkey or a plane in Poland without problem. They know the systems. Most of those systems are sold by American companies. So we're seeing companies like Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman making significant gains over the last year because their projected sales are going up. They're also actively lobbying to be seen as the best resource for any problem that might be facing the future.
So, Ksenia, although down from Cold War highs, SIPRI warns that the era of nuclear disarmament appears to be ending. So what's next for the world?
Well, I think even though the landscape may seem depressing, we can see that, for example, in terms of arms control and proliferation, in the absence of significant progress towards disarmament, the focus may shift towards maintaining and strengthening the existing arms control and non-proliferation regime. So such treaties as NPT, Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, they remain crucial to sustain those systems. And I think the international efforts will go towards sustaining those. In terms of risk reduction and strategic stability, the efforts to manage nuclear risks protect and maintain strategic stability between nuclear armed states, of course, will continue to be essential, and even more so in upcoming future. So diplomatic channels, different diplomatic initiatives, and various communication mechanisms and confidence building measures will also contribute to reducing the nuclear risks in the future, and I think would be one of the priorities of the countries in the future. And last but not the least, the emerging technologies and arms control, because the emerging technologies such as hypersonic missiles, cyber warfare, AI in military systems, they introduce new challenges. So working towards regulating those and actually counting the possible implications of the integration of emerging technology in the existing military capability will also be one of the focuses for future negotiations.
So, Susi, would you agree, like Russia's attack on Ukraine hampered diplomatic efforts on nuclear arms control and disarmament?
Well, in some ways, it might seem like that. But what we have seen also is that in the last year, 6 countries joined the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, rejecting anything and everything to do with these weapons, including threats. We have also seen an overwhelming global response to the threats to use nuclear weapons, unlike anything we've seen since the 1980s. In history, every time there's been a major nuclear crisis, within the next few years, there's a massive breakthrough on arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament. And we might just have hit the tipping point to end the nuclear threat forever. Fortunately, we have a treaty that helps us do that, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It's a path to the end of nuclear weapons. And now it's incumbent upon all states that think these threats are a problem to join the treaty, to engage with its processes, and to make the world safer for the rest of us.
So, Ksenia, apart from traditional and renowned arms companies, could you talk to us about the influence of defense lobbyists on government spending? I mean, how influential are they?
Well, I think the defense lobbyists, they definitely play a significant role in shaping government spending decisions because they have various influence channels, like they engaged in direct lobbying efforts, including meeting with government officials and lawmakers and policymakers to present, their clients' positions and priorities. And also they have access to information that is very specialized and limited to other actors within this field. So this knowledge enables them to provide policymakers with data analysis and arguments that would support the increase for the increase of defense spending. So these could definitely be considered as their impact on those decisions. However, it is very important to say that they are still under a certain scrutiny, and concerns about the influence of money in politics and potential conflicts of interest have led to calls for greater transparency, ethic reforms, and stricter regulations of involvement of those.
All right, ladies, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.